All right, guys, in the world of unexpected, let's talk about a Bane and Deathstroke movie. Yeah, that's actually happening according to all of the major sources in the Hollywood industry, the movie news industry. And I have some thoughts about this. And even though we don't have that many details, I do think the one little piece of information that was snuck in here that these news sources like Deadline have been reporting is interesting, actually not even for DC, but for Marvel, surprisingly. So let's talk about this Bane Deathstroke movie. So it has been reported by, again, all the major trades that there is in development from DC Studios as part of the DCU, it looks like, although I don't think officially confirmed that that's the case. Who knows? Maybe it's part of the Batman universe. I highly doubt it. But let's just go into the assumption, I think a very safe assumption, that this Bane Deathstroke movie is going to be a part of the DCU, which we'll talk about, which makes some sense as it lines up with the theme of Chapter 1 of the DCU. But it has been announced that a Bane and Deathstroke movie is in development. Now, for those of you who are not aware, I'm sure most of you are aware of Bane, probably even those of you who have not been following comic books and comic book movies. Bane was the main villain in The Dark Knight Rises, played by Tom Hardy. He's the guy who wears the mask. And in the comics, he usually has the bigger mask. He's usually even bigger, kind of monstrous, gargantuan size. If those of you who have been watching Kite Man or Harley Quinn, he's played, he's one of the more comedic characters in that show, but he comes off as very funny, but usually he's quite intimidating. He has literal venom in his veins. And so he's quite an interesting character because there's room for dimensionality, right, with a character like Bane. And we saw some of it explored a little bit in The Dark Knight Rises with his relationship with Talia al Ghul. But there's also the side of Bane that can be very comedic, and, we see that in Harley Quinn, but even more so than comedic, because usually he's not a comedy character other than your Batman and Robins, for example. You have a more brooding, hulking kind of, not to say he's a brute necessarily, but he's a character that can be a physical presence even more so than he is verbose, for example. I think the Tom Hardy version went for a more, obviously Tom Hardy was incredibly, incredibly well built and fit for that movie, but I think even more so they wanted to develop him as a character, obviously with his time in the pit and whatnot. But Bane is an interesting character because he can fit a lot of different roles. There's actually a lot of area for some nuanced character development with Bane. So there is that. Now, Deathstroke, Slade Wilson, and if that name sounds familiar for those of you who have been following the MCU, that is, I think Deathstroke actually came first, Slade Wilson, and then Deadpool was a parody of that with Wade Wilson. But Slade Wilson is a mercenary. He is one of the bigger Batman villains. And I should mention that, with Bane being in The Dark Knight Rises, Bane is also part of the Batman Rogues Gallery. So Bane and Deathstroke both, although both have obviously appeared with other superheroes and alongside other supervillains before. But Deathstroke is a mercenary. He looks sort of like, he's more of like an assassin version of Deadpool. I know that, like I said, Slade Wilson, I think, came first, but just to give a frame of reference here. And yeah, I mean, not a lot. I don't know a whole ton about the character, but he did make a brief appearance in both the theatrical cut of Justice League and the Snyder cut of Justice League in the post-credit scene where he was met by Lex Luthor. He was, I believe, going to be the main antagonist for the Ben Affleck Batman movie. And he is, he's a part of the Batman Rogues Gallery. He's a pretty big part of it as well. So this is interesting, right? Now, that's the breaking news. But let's actually talk about some of the implications here. One for the DCU and one actually for the MCU in an interesting way, as I'll, touch upon the other little piece of news that was released with this whole story. So for the DCU, right, here are a couple takeaways. One being, this is part of the chapter known as Gods and Monsters, right? And I don't know too much about Deathstroke in terms of gods and monsters. I'm not entirely sure where he fits in that paradigm, but Bane seems like a very interesting character to fit in there because while he's not necessarily a monster, or he's not, clearly not a god in the DCU, he kind of fits the mold of maybe a more tragic character, right? I think that there's a side of him that can be monstrous, but maybe less monstrous and more misunderstood as a character. And so where he fits into the gods and monsters theme, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that Bane could be an interesting character to explore here as well. Deathstroke, like I said, not entirely sure if he fits in with that scheme, but maybe James Gunn thought he would be a very fun character to pair with Bane. I also think it's notable that they are making an entire separate film, not a TV show, not even them appearing in Brave and the Bold, but having an entirely separate film just dedicated to Bane and Deathstroke. It seems to me that these two characters would then become a much larger part of the DCU, right? And it's, what else is interesting is now we're getting a little bit more of the landscape of Gods and Monsters. The first chapter of the DCU, for those of you who are unaware, it's sort of like the MCU's phase 1 is the equivalent of the DCU's chapter 1, I suppose. And it looks like, there's not, like I've been saying, there's not infinite space, right? Unfortunately for James Gunn, to have as many movies as you want about as many characters as you want. And just like the MCU has been seeing lately, oversaturation with their TV shows is not always the best thing. So I would imagine James Gunn's a very thoughtful person. I'm sure he's looking at the MCU and trying to learn from their mistakes as well, and also learn from the mistakes of the DCEU. It's interesting to me that, you have your established characters showing up. Obviously, you start with Superman, you're going to get Supergirl, you're going to have Batman, you're going to have Wonder Woman, maybe, although maybe not with Paradise Lost, which is an HBO Max show. You're going to have Green Lantern with Lanterns, and no sign of Aquaman, Cyborg, Flash. But, you're going to have some of your main characters. Even characters like Booster Gold or Blue Beetle will show up, right? These are sort of A and B, like lower B tier characters, but characters that are much more well known. But then the more we hear about the later plans of the DCU, so we're moving past now the initial chunk of movies, even Swamp Thing, for example, then we're getting some interesting films. I just talked about Sergeant Rock, which is a character I had never heard of before, and obviously more people would have heard of Bane, especially because of The Dark Knight Rises, and Deathstroke. But again, we don't have infinite time here, and I don't anticipate the DCU releasing 10 films a year, right? So I find it interesting that James Gunn is intentionally choosing to focus on these characters, because it certainly seems to indicate that these characters will be a very important part of the DCU moving forward, which I find very interesting. The other thing, though, that I wanted to talk about here, because there is one more little bit of news that comes along with the Bane and Deathstroke movie announcement, at least rumored announcement, is the writer. So it's actually been reported that the writer of this film is somebody named Matthew Orton. Now, Matthew Orton, his name sounded somewhat familiar to me. And sure enough, in the article, as I read it, there's a reason why. Matthew Orton is actually one of the writers for Captain America Brave New World. Now, he doesn't have, I believe he doesn't have a whole ton of other credits from this, for other than Captain America Brave New World. At least I didn't see from the initial reporting. But the reason that I think this is interesting from an MCU perspective is that, James Gunn is pretty particular with his writers, right? And I don't think he would just pick a random person, like the Madam Web writers who also wrote Morbius. I don't think James Gunn would just be like, oh yeah, you guys can write a DCU movie. No, I think he's probably very particular in the people that he's choosing to write and produce these movies. And so I think it's interesting that he picked someone like Matthew Orton, who is just coming off of Captain America Brave New World. Now, James Gunn himself has probably not seen Captain America Brave New World. I'm sure he and Kevin Feige are close, but I don't think at this point Kevin Feige is inviting James Gunn over to see test screenings of Captain America Brave New World, right? I don't think that's the case. But what I think this indicates here is that James Gunn looked at Matthew Orton and trusted his profile, saw some of his writing that he really liked. Maybe even Matthew Orton wrote a preliminary script for James Gunn, and it was something that James Gunn was a fan of. So I know Captain America Brave New World went through a lot of rewrites, but this actually gives me some hope, because I would assume that Matthew Orton is one of the writers who helped pitch into the new shaping of the film. And I actually think that this is good news for Captain America Brave New World, and it seems like it will be a good sign that this film is headed in a good direction. So actually, both good news for the MCU and the DCU. In terms of, just to wrap up this news about the Bane and Deathstroke movie, I remain very curious about a roadmap for this DCU. James Gunn absolutely does not have to announce the Justice League or Justice Society or whatever movie he wants to do at the end of chapter 1 at this point. But it is curious because you're trying to trace some kind of through line story here. Again, there doesn't necessarily have to be one. For the MCU's phase 1, it was just introducing Iron Man and Captain America, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Hulk, and Thor. So it wasn't necessarily, a roadmap, but you started to see the pieces line up with Loki, and Infinity Stones eventually started to pop up. So I'd be very curious to see if there is a roadmap here that it starts to appear with Gods and Monsters. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of a Bane and Deathstroke movie? Is this something that you'd be interested in seeing, or maybe something that you're not interested at all in watching? Let me know in the comments down below.